Coming up, Queensland's own international child movie star in the 1950s, who can also claim he played drums on the tarmac at the old Brisbane airport. He played drums in a jazz band, then in the 60s he joined the Bee Gees. Colin Petersen is an old boy from Ipswich Grammar School and became a lifelong friend of Maurice Gibb. Now aged in his 70s, his life story is still being written, and he has returned to the stage, but not in the role you would expect. Colin Petersen is my special guest in this episode of Ipswich Today. It's Wednesday, October 12, 2022, and I'm Alan Roebuck. Ipswich Today acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which it is produced and pays respects to elders past, present and emerging. This podcast is supported by Kinetics, people-powered web hosting trusted by Australian businesses since 1999. Colin Petersen, thank you for speaking with Ipswich Today.
It's an absolute pleasure, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Look, let's start at the beginning. Where were you born?
I was born in Kingaroy, which is a small country town in the South Burnett district in Queensland.
Yeah, made famous by a former premier, nonetheless.
Exactly. Well, okay. We'll move on from that.
What are your earliest memories of growing up there?
Goodness me. Few memories music-wise. I remember I was so overawed, really, by hearing music on the radio. One of the first songs I can remember is a song called Singing in the Rain from the movie of the same title.
Yes.
And one thing that struck me, that no one, I wouldn't hold a conversation if there was a song on the radio. I would just sit there in a mystical state.
Colin, I think we could all relate to that because I reckon everybody has their very favourite first song that they can remember.
Well, the thing about songs, and I touched on this with the show, is, and it is extraordinary how certain songs, and particularly the recordings of those songs, can take you back in an instant to a certain time in a certain place. Members of the audience who we chat with after the show, which is part of the night that I really enjoy, constantly say to me, that particular song, I can picture where I was at that particular time. We were in the front of our old Holden, or I had my first kiss with that song in the background, or little things like that, you know. And that is the wonderful thing about songs. And, well, the Gibbs gave us so many over a long period of time.
They certainly did.
I had just returned home to Australia from doing my third and final film, a film called A Cry from the Streets. And that was the end of my acting career because my parents decided to pull me out of it and get me back to school. And that was tough at the time because it wasn't so much the fame, which started with Smiley, obviously.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much the fame, it was the art of making a movie. And I was fascinated by all the different jobs that people had to do.
All right, let me take you back. Let me take you back, Colin. Have a listen to this.
Smiley! Smiley!
Coming, Mum.
Smiley, they call him. Smiley's his name. Happy-go-lucky.
Well, there you go. There's a bit of a blast from the past for you. Colin, the prevailing.
That is my first scene in the movie. And that was the first scene that we shot. And I was perched up in the top of this tree, pretending I was Captain Cook in the crow's nest. And I had this dreadful moment of stage fright. I'd had that once before when I was really little up in Kingaroy doing a tap dance in a show in a hall called, they had these shows called a Stedfords.
Yes.
think that they were the only two occasions that really affected me. I've just sort of I got over that pretty early on there. And that song, by the way, was sung by an Australian lady, Shirley Abbott-Kerr, and she thinks she had a few hit records in London at the time. And it's a very pretty tune, I think. It is.
Looking at the movie now through the lens of 2022, it certainly shows up the prevailing attitudes of the 50s, which, you know, they don't translate well to today. However, it's a great time capsule of Australia in that period. Interesting too, the book was released 10 years before the movie was made.
What, the record? Or
No, the book. The book was released in 1945 and the project shelved, which worked in your favour. Now, were you 10 years old at the time, I think?
I was 9 when I did it.
Okay.
And there were two books, Smiley and Smiley Gets a Gun, and they were written by an Australian chap called Maurice Raymond, who was brought up in a Queensland town called Augathella. He went on in life and became quite a well-known journalist in London. He wrote for The Observer and wrote features for The Observer, and I think he would have possibly been in his 30s when he decided to have a stab at writing a novel. A lot of novels are semi-autobiographical, aren't they, really? And this was about his childhood growing up in Augathella, and he wasn't the real Smiley, but the real Smiley was his best mate, and it was about their adventures together. And it's a simple yarn about a little kid striving to buy a bicycle, and it was, well, I think charming is the word. I was so fortunate to land such a role that I could feel really comfortable doing, because I previously lived in a small town. I had a lot of dialogue because I was in virtually every scene. So Mum and I would spend a couple of hours every night going through the script, the scenes for the following day. And then when I'd learnt my part, Mum would say, "Hang on, Colin, hang on. We're only halfway there." And I say, "What do you mean, Mum, we're halfway there? I know my line." She said, "Now we're going to swap roles. And I'll play Smiley and you play the other character." I think that was a stroke of genius on her behalf.
Wow.
Because what would happen in a scene is that I would anticipate what the other character was saying.
Yeah.
And I would understand exactly what the motives behind their dialogue were. And so there were moments there, I remember doing scenes with Chips Rafferty, that I would forget the cameras and the crew and the people around, and it was just like having a conversation with him. I think there's a term for it. It's called in the zone.
Oh, yes.
And when you're in the zone, you've got all the time slows down, and you've got all the time in the world to play your part.
Did your mum come from a theatrical background?
She played the piano. She could read. She learned as a young child. I think she was. We weren't Catholic. We were Methodists, but she went to piano lessons and learned. A nun taught her. She had, apart from being able to read, if you play or she heard a song on the radio, you left her for about 10, 15 minutes, she'd play it.
Oh, that's gifted. I'm jealous of that.
She had a great ear. And the drumming was just in me. I used to, always, I remember, "Stop tapping away at the table, Colin." I'd been banging away with my knife and fork. And
so your mum was very supportive. Did you have any formal acting training?
No, none at all. None at all. I remember when it was announced that this English film company London Films were coming out to Australia to find a boy to do the role. Mum zapped down the library, first of all, and got the book. So we read the book together. And I remember when she handed me the newspaper and said, "You read the front page, Colin." No, she wouldn't have said Colin. She would have said boy. Listen, boy, you read that front page article. It was always boy when she was serious. And I read this article about the film crew coming out and blah, blah, blah. I said to Mum, "I've had no experience at this, Mum. You know, there's no point me going along to the audition." And she said, "Listen, boy, you've been up on a stage so many times now with these big jazz bands," which I'd done because I'd previously taken tuition. And she said, "All you're doing with those audiences, you're communicating through your music. Now, in this instance, you'll be communicating with words to the camera. And there's absolutely no difference. So you can do this, I'm convinced." So Julie, we went along to the audition and I landed the role.
Now, I hear it was a bit of a two-stage process to actually get the role. Can you tell us about that?
I turned up in my Sunday suit, made of this dreadful material called terraline, with long socks, short pants, shiny shoes, and a tie, and a jacket, and with my scrapbook. I'd put these press clippings in the scrapbook, little articles of the concerts that I'd done. And one clipping I was particularly proud of was a photograph of me meeting Gene Krupa, who you think Eric Clapton is a famous musician. Let me tell you, Gene Krupa was a legend, an absolute legend. And I met him at Brisbane Airport with my drums set up on the tarmac. He walked down from the plane across to the drums, and Harry Lebler, my teacher, had taught me a little drum solo to play. And he said, if Mr. Krupa is still standing next to you when you finish this little drum solo, you just play it again. So, and I was particularly proud of this photograph, but the director, Anthony Kimmins, wasn't impressed at all and just tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Oh, it's a lovely thing to do, being a musician, you keep it up." And I walked out of the cinema and told Mum the story, and she said, "Oh, perhaps it's not meant to be, Colin." She was a big believer in fate. So I went down on the tram with Mum and got out of my suit in my old clothes and off with the shoes, bare feet. And I was playing marbles under one of those Queenslanders in the dirt.
Yes, you would have been a bit dusty by then.
I was. And for some reason, and this changed my life, I thought to myself, I'll go back to the cinema because maybe I can just have a glimpse through a window or something of the process. I was just fascinated with the process.
Yep.
And I literally walked down the laneway at the side of the cinema, and as I approached this staircase leading up to the fire doors, they opened, and the director, who I'd seen earlier, came out and lit up a cigarette. He was just having a bit of a break from the auditions. He had 3 boys, I think, inside. And he looked at me, he didn't recognise me, and he said, "What are you doing here?" And I'm no fool. I wasn't going to say, "Hey, don't you remember you saw me an hour ago or something, and you didn't think I was right for the role?" I said, "I'm here for the audition."
Oh, what a great story.
And he looked at me again, and then he said, "Do you think you'd be any good at this?" And I'm halfway up the stairs before he finished the sentence. And we sat on the stairs together, and we read through a scene from the movie, and it happened to be a scene at the police sergeant's office, and the director relayed to Mum later on when we started filming that he decided there and then that I was the boy to do the role. So it was literally a chance meeting there. 2 minutes before, I would have walked past, he would have come out, I would have gone. And conversely, a minute after he finished his cigarette, he would have gone back inside and I would have walked past.
I hope your mum said it was fate yet again.
Well, she did actually. When I went back to the house, I went up the back stairs and Mum's sitting there with Grandma and they're having a cup of tea and in all probability ice Vovo biscuits. And I said to Mum, no, she said, where have you been? And you didn't have to account for yourself in those days, home before dark, that was it.
Before the lights came on?
Yeah.
Yep.
And I said, I went back to the cinema. And she said, oh, Colin, there's no point in that. It just wasn't meant to be. And I said, you're wrong, Mum. I met the director again. And we read through a scene in the movie. And he took my details, my phone number and everything. And he said he'll be in touch. And I'll be flying down to Sydney next week for a screen test.
And your mum thought, what?
Mum turned to Grandma, this is true, word for word, and she said, isn't it extraordinary, Mum? She said, this is fate. Isn't it wonderful that Colin met up with him again?
Colin, I want to test your memory here. At the start of our chat, I played a little bit of the actual opening credits of the film, but can you remember the actual first words you said in Smiley?
I'm Captain Cook.
Oh, you're close. You're so close. Can I reveal it for you? Here we go.
Lying on the starboard bow. Molly. Oh, Molly.
Oh, thanks for playing along with that.
And then it comes in with the Captain Cook.
That is correct.
Yeah, I'd forgotten that.
Thanks for being a good sport. We could play this again. Can you remember your last words?
It went on about Captain Cook. And then
the last scene, where you got the bike, where you got the push bike. I know it's a test.
Jehoshaphat.
Yes, now there's a word you don't hear often. Let's have a listen to it right now.
Okay.
Smiley, I'd like to show my appreciation of your brave action.
What a beauty. Jehoshaphat.
Jehoshaphat.
That was a lovely little touch for the character, wasn't it?
It was. It was indeed.
A little kid so young had the fascination with big words like flabbergasting and words like that. It was a lovely little touch to it. In fact, I was just so lucky to be given such a wonderful script.
Yeah.
Really. And a decade on, I was so lucky again as a drummer to be given such wonderful songs to play to.
Yeah. Well, look, I want to move on from that. Yes, we've spent a fair bit of time on the movie there. Now,
wait, the way we're going to talk all day. We'll talk all day.
Yeah. Look, there was a lot going on between movies and music in your teens. Tell us the story of meeting Maurice Gibb.
I'd heard of the Gibb brothers through hearing them on Brisbane radio. A disc jockey called Bill Gates had sort of taken them under his wing, so to speak, got them into the studio at 4BH in Brisbane,
yeah,
and recorded some of their songs and played them over the air. They didn't have a record deal at the time, no records released at all. And I'd heard them for the first time, I think, when I was up at Ipswich Grammar School. And what was the song? It could have been 3 Kisses of Love, something like that. And there was the harmonies that struck me first. And so then I moved from Ipswich Grammar School down to art school in Brisbane. And I spent about a year and a half or something at art school, where I met Stevie Kipner. He was in my same class, and he was a singer and wanted to be in a band. I'd already made really great friends with another young man called Carl Grossman. He was a day student at Ipswich Grammar, and we'd been trying to we wrote some songs together. And he was a really great guitar player, great rhythm guitar player. And so the 3 of us sort of got together. Carl was at uni studying law, and we took on a couple of other players, and we started gigging around Brisbane. Then we all decided to have a go at being professional and left Brisbane. And it was only a couple of weeks after we arrived in Sydney, I was at a venue called The Bowl in Castlereagh Street. And Maurice Gibb came up to me and introduced himself, and we just hit it off immediately. I finished up that night going back to the Gibb home. We sat up all night, literally all night. But I became a really close friend of Maurice's, and I got on well with the other 2 as well. So during the year and a half or so that followed, I had the opportunity, when I had time away from my band, to do some recordings with them. I recorded maybe about 8 tracks or something like that with them in Sydney. And then after I decided to go back to England to pick up the pieces of my acting career, it was they suggested that if nothing had eventuated, that the offer would be there for me to join the band, which I did in early February. So when they arrived in England. And so it was in early February that I officially became the 4th Bee Gee.
And you were with the band, was it 2 or 3 years?
Going on 3 years. Mm-hmm. I think it was like 2 years and 9 months, a similar period of time, incidentally, that I spent filming, which is sort of interesting, I guess.
Yeah. Now, it must have felt like you entered another world, from Kingaroy to London. That period with the band, Colin, fame, I'm guessing, came quite fast from, a person not known and then in the public eye and being adored on stage. Is that how it sort of happened, and how did you handle that fame?
Well, fortunately, I think, see, we're all so young.
Yeah.
The twins, for instance, were like 16 when they arrived in England, or 17 at the most. And as history recalls, fame was a problem, particularly the twins, because it was on such a scale that it was difficult for them to really get any perspective on. For my part, I think that, of course, I enjoyed the adulation, and for a brief period there, driving around London in my Ferrari, a second-hand, I should add, but a beautiful car. But there was always that voice in my ear, my mother, back to my mother. And a typical instance of that was, we were walking down a street in London, and the film had been released, and we'd made some public appearances with regarding the film, and so I was really well known in London. The film grossed more than The King and I. This couple walk up to Mum and I in the street and asked Mum whether I was the boy in the film, and she replied, yes, he is. And they said, would you mind if we got an autograph? So I duly signed a bit of paper or whatever they had, and then we walk on. And just down the street, when we're out of earshot, so to speak, Mum says, stop. And again, I repeat myself, but she probably said, now listen, boy. What she said was, Colin, I'm a bit disappointed. And I said, why, Mum? And she said, you didn't spend enough time with those people. You were a bit short with them. And I said, Mum, I'm just keen to wherever we are going, you know, Trafalgar Square or whatever. And she said, now you listen. She said, wasn't for those people, you wouldn't be in a job. Now, don't get me wrong. You're very good at what you're doing, and hats off to you. But always remember, there's a kid down the road who can kick a football better than you. And I was always on the job, you know. We spent hours and hours and hours in recording studios, and it was, for me, it was do the job well and take pride in what you achieve.
Australian-born Robert Stigwood was still perfecting his craft as a band manager and record producer with the Bee Gees. And now you and he came to blows. What happened?
I should point out that he really wasn't our producer. He spent very little time in this. Well, he used to come in for the mixing sessions and contribute, but he wasn't a producer in the strict sense. We never really had a producer in the strict sense. I went on to production after the Gibbs, but Robert would never hesitate in getting his name up on in print. So anyway, I just thought I'd like to clear that up.
No, that's a good point.
Without Robert Stigwood, the Bee Gees would never have happened. It takes a team for something like that to work. And he was an absolutely brilliant manager. I can't recall any mishaps on the road. Everything ran like clockwork. There were no mobile phones, none of that stuff. And there we set off to Europe with an orchestra, and it just ran without a hitch. He was great with publicity. He was great with vision. He saw the big picture of us with an orchestra which made us unique on stage. We were the first band, I think, that stepped up on a stage with an orchestra, I believe. And it set us apart and made us special. Unfortunately, he was in fact, and the Gibbs later sued him on these sort of grounds. He was taking a bigger piece of the pie than he should have been taking. And so after the band started to fall apart, people say to me, why did it end? You know, you're all so stupid. You should have stayed together. Well, that's not life. Things end in life. And I think that the two twins particularly felt that they wanted to prove that they could make some impact as individuals, which they'd never had the opportunity of doing with the Bee Gees. It was always the big brother and the two little cute twins. So when they got to 69, they wanted to venture out. And Vince actually was the first to leave. He wanted just to play in a band, no orchestra, wanted to play more blues-orientated music. And then it left the four of us. A few months later, Robin leaves. There was some sort of argument about what would be our next single, and Stigwood passed on a track that Robin, Lamplight, I think it was called, sung, and went in favour of a track with Barry singing lead. But it would have happened anyway. So then there was the three of us. Then I put my hand up and started to ask questions where all the money was going. Look, don't get me wrong, we lived very well. We always stayed in the most palatial hotels and all that sort of thing. But the fact was that there was a conflict of interest there, because as manager, we signed a management agreement with him. As manager, he advises us to sign with him for recording. So there's a conflict of interest there. His job as manager was to get us the best deal he could for us. You can't negotiate on someone's behalf with yourself. So that's what he was doing. So, look, it all unravelled, but that's life, and we all moved on. I went on to management myself and producing, and with a very talented a young man, an Irish singer-songwriter called Jonathan Kelly. We never had that magical hit single for various reasons, but he did sell well with his albums, played to quite big audiences in concert at universities and colleges. That was a lovely experience. Life is an adventure. So, but the thing is, it's all come full circle now with this band that I'm with.
And that's where we should move to. Let's fast forward to 2022 and the best of the Bee Gees. And Colin Petersen, a great montage of songs there from the actual show itself. Tell us about the show.
Goodness me. I've been out of the limelight for a long, long time. I met up my ex-wife, Joanne, we're still very close friends, was working for a music publisher, MCA, in Sydney. And on a trip to Tamworth, she came across Keith Urban, who she signed for publishing immediately. She saw the stardom in Keith Urban. These were very early days, you should remember.
Yes.
Keith was managed by a man called Greg Shaw, and the Redcliffe Council put on a bit of a tribute to my life at the museum. I joked to the audience on the opening. I said, so this is where aging pop stars end up, in museums. Anyway, I invited Greg, who I'd kept in contact with, to this exhibition. And a couple of weeks after that, he phoned me up and said, Colin, that was great, that exhibition, and it was so well presented. And he said, by the way, I'm managing a band, a BG tribute band. The alarm bell sort of rang for me because, now I don't want to sound elitist here, but when you've been in the real deal, I was a bit reluctant because I didn't want to be in something that was okay, sort of thing. And I said to Greg, oh, look, I don't know about this, Greg, really. I haven't, been up on a stage even for so many years and whatever. And he said, you spoke to the audience really well in Redcliffe. At least come and see the band. So he sends a driver up to me. I was living in Mullaney. I met Greg at the airport and we went up to Townsville. And I remember the moment, it was about halfway through the third song. And I thought, bloody hell, this band are really good. They really are. And there's no sort of flash in what they're playing. Everything's so subtle and they're really good. And the production's good. And I turned to Greg and I said, this band are really, really great, Greg. He said, I know, they've been doing this for 24 years or 22 years or something. And he said, would you like to be involved in it? And I said, what do you mean involved? He said, well, I envisage you getting up a few times during the show and giving little stories that lead on to the next song. And just give the audience some idea of what it was like to really be there at the time. That will be your job. And I said, okay, I'll do it. And the first show was in Penrith. And I was so nervous. I really was nervous.
What year was this, Colin?
Oh, goodness me, this could be going on 3 years ago now.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm pacing up and down the veranda of this little cottage I was renting in Mullaney, and I wrote out little pieces of what I was planning on saying, and I learnt them off. I didn't have Mum by my side, unfortunately, but anyway, and then I get a call from a friend of mine called Ron Kelly, who is an actor. And he said he was aware of what I was undertaking here. And he said, how are you going with it, Colin? Have you learned what you're going to say? Have you learned it? And I said, yeah. He said, do you feel comfortable with it? And I said, yeah, I think it's well written and it's concise. And he said, now, let me tell you something. He said, if you get up on that stage and it seems like you're giving a speech, it'll still be okay because what you're saying is interesting, but if you can make the audience feel that you've just strolled on and you're having a chat, he said, then you'll get them. And there's a big difference, he said. And I've taken his advice on board, and it's natural to me now. I just feel so relaxed when I walk on. Obviously, it's work, and I've got to remember things and names and blah, blah, blah. But I focus on like 3 or 4 faces, make sure our lighting guy has set it up so I can see the first few rows. And I just chat to a face and tell a little story, and then another face, and just have a chat, as he said. And the audience seemed to enjoy my part of the show. But look, I'm not the whole show. The band are lovely players.
Yep, that montage really sounded terrific.
And you've only got those vocals. They're so close. Yep. They really are.
Yep.
But the whole thread of the show is the songs. It's those wonderful songs that the Gibb brothers wrote over 40-odd years.
And the great news is the show is coming to Ipswich on November the 12th at the Ipswich Civic Centre. Let's spread the news, podcast listeners, and get as many people there as we can. Colin Petersen, this has been an absolute pleasure and honour to have this chat with you today.
It was great fun for me, and thank you for making me feel so relaxed as well.
Thanks again to Colin Petersen. And a reminder to look for handy links in the show notes, including to Ipswich Civic Centre, where you can book your tickets online for the best of the Bee Gees. Ipswich Today is supported by Kinetics, people-powered web hosting trusted by Australian businesses since 1999. This podcast is also listener-supported. Please make a once-only gift or regular donation to help keep it online. Just go to ipswichtoday.com.au and click the donate button on the homepage to make a payment through PayPal. Follow and stream this podcast from your favourite app, including iHeartRadio and Amazon Music Podcasts, or play Ipswich Today from smart speakers. Music is supplied by Purple Planet Music. This is Alan Roebuck. Thank you for listening.